Welcome, everybody. The song that Annabella played was called Everything Possible. It was written by an amazing singer-songwriter named Fred Small. Is anybody familiar with him? You know his music? Yay. I met Fred at the Philly Folk Festival, I think in 1984, and I was introduced to him by Robin Oakes, who is Phil Oakes' niece. Phil Oakes was another amazing singer-songwriter who passed many years ago. And when I first met Fred, it was like kindred spirit. I just knew we would be friends. So fast forward several years later, my parents are living in Florida, and he's going to be playing at a synagogue of all places in Hollywood, Florida. So I asked my parents, "Can Fred sleep on your couch?" Because a lot of folk singers couch surf. And not knowing him at all, but trusting me, they said sure. And I think they actually went to the concert. So that's an indication of the cheerleaders that my parents were. Pretty much anything that I wanted to do, as long as they knew it was safe. They still thought it was Meshuggah, crazy a little bit, some of the things that I did, but they trusted me. So I encourage you to, listen to that song again. And it's the kind of song that I think every parent should play for their children, should want for their children, is to know that anything is possible. And I had that blessedly with my parents. Now today would have been my mother's 98th birthday. That is so hard for me to imagine. And even though my parents are long gone, he died in 2008, she died in 2010, I feel them with me every day, all the time. I talk to them. They're the ancestors that I pray with at night. They're the people that I consult, like, what do I do here? Any suggestions? I wear my grandmother's pinky ring that my mother gave to me before she died, because she wanted to see me wear it. So I want to read something that I wrote. Now, this was something that I wrote around the 10th anniversary of her passing, but it's just as important because today would have been her 98th birthday. It's called Long Before I Knew Her. Long before I knew her, long before she met my dad, long before they created their sweet love story, long before my sister Jan Weinstein Sparta and I were born, long before she would become a grandmother and great-grandmother. Wonder what dreams that she had that were never fulfilled. I imagine she would have said it was a life well lived with everything she could ever have wanted. I'm honoring today, when I wrote this, November 26, 2020, I'm honoring a decade since she beamed up. Hard to believe that so much time has passed without her here, but I commune daily with her and my dad, who died 2.5 years before she did. Happy Thanksgiving in heaven, Mama Cakes. And there's a picture of her that was taken when she was 22 years old. She was heading to the wedding of a friend as a bridesmaid. Selma Rose Hirsch Weinstein was born into a large and loving family. My grandmother Henrietta was one of 13 Bernstein siblings of Eastern European Jewish origins. I once asked her my mother, how they managed so many kids. Her response was that the older ones took care of the younger ones. My question went deeper than that. How the heck did they afford the expenses of raising so many, and where did they have a house big enough to accommodate them? My great-grandfather owned a corner store. I imagine that's how my grandmother developed her belief in a money tree in the backyard that she told my parents we had too. My Uncle Jim was her protective older brother. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about Uncle Jimmy parking spots. He was our family parking angel. So anyway, my Uncle Jim was her protective older brother and playmate, as were her numerous cousins, who all lived within a few blocks of each other. One of her uncles referred to her as Sally up the alley. She would tell me that one of the reasons she viewed herself as being shy was because she didn't need to seek out friends in her childhood. The funny thing is, I never saw her that way, since she seemed to make friends wherever she went. My parents met at a party of a mutual friend. My mother had been dating a man that I referred to as on again, off again Freddie. He stood her up for their date on New Year's Eve, and needless to say, she was angry. When she arrived at the shindig, he beckoned her over. She retorted, "If you want me, you come to me." My father Moish witnessed this and thought, that girl's got chutzpah, which is Yiddish for guts. He approached her, talked all evening, and asked if he could drive her home. When she arrived, she told my grandmother, "Tonight I met the man I'm going to marry." Their first date was at a Chinese restaurant, and her fortune said, "You better prepare your hope chest." Less than a year later, they married. My sister and I came along a few years afterward and were raised in a loving home with parents who showered us with attention and affection, seeing to it that our needs were met for food, shelter, clothing, toys, education, travel, and activities. They had a true partnership. They both worked outside the home and in. My dad was a milkman and then a SEPTA bus driver. My mom had a series of jobs that enabled her to be home with us until we were old enough to be latchkey kids, when she got a job as a switchboard operator at Sears that she had until she retired in 1989. She was an Avon rep, which was great for my sister and me, since we had babysitting jobs lined up for her customers, as well as a gate guard at our local pool in the summer. She sewed doll clothes for a woman named Mrs. Handy. I love that coincidence, Handy sewing. She also wrote a local community column for the Burlington County Times, letting readers know who was getting married, graduating, and having babies. She inspired me to be a Renaissance woman too. When my dad came home, he wasn't the babysitter, he was the daddy. He didn't help my mother with our care or housekeeping. He knew he was equally responsible. They spoke all of the 5 love languages fluently, as they were affectionate in word and action, spent quality time together, gave each other cards and gifts spontaneously, and did acts of service to make each other's lives easier. Funny thing is, I never had a relationship that emulated theirs, still welcoming it since they showed me that it was possible. She enjoyed her role as a mother, seemingly something she was born to do. She told me that rather than looking forward to our return to school at the end of summer, she cried since she would miss us. We played and learned simultaneously. She took us to the library up the street weekly and went to story hour led by the library lady, as I called her. I would come home with a stack of books, which I would read in time to return the following week. Our home had the Funkin' Wagnalls Encyclopedia, remember that? Lining bookshelves in the dining room, which she encouraged us to use regularly for research for school assignments and just for the heck of it. Book lover that I've long been, I would page through it for fun. I was a quirky kid. Music was a huge part of our home, with the sounds of Rodgers and Hammerstein lyrics wafting through the air as we would sing and dance along. We used to listen to the soundtrack of South Pacific that I memorized the song, listen to the soundtrack from South Pacific so many times that I memorized the songs. I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair. You've got to be carefully taught, Happy Talk, Some Enchanted Evening, and Dites-moi. She had a sweet voice that had lulled me to sleep on many occasions. Although my father tried mightily, his voice was not so soothing. To his credit, what he lacked in talent, he made up for in enthusiasm. Blessedly, my voice resembles my mother's lilt more than my father's gravel. She was a room mother, and when my sister and I were in elementary school, making cookies and cupcakes for parties and acting as chaperones on trips. Girl Scout cookie parent was added to our resume as boxes lined the couch in the kitchen. She and my dad would take them to work to sell, and I remember toting them in a wagon up and down the street back when it was safe to be a little door-to-door saleswoman. When we joined the swim team, she not only cheered from the sidelines in our meets, but would be a timer and hand our ribbons out afterwards. A story from my mother's young adulthood came to my awareness in 2008. When Barack Obama was elected for his first term, I mused with her about how amazing it was, given that I grew up in the 1960s and witnessed the inequities that divided folks based on the color of their skin. She related that when she was 18 and her father had recently died, she and my grandmother took a bus trip from Philly to Florida. This was 1942 during World War II, and the bus was filled with soldiers, sailors, and Marines. When the bus pulled into DC, the white bus driver yelled, "All you," and he used the N-word that I won't glorify by spelling it out or saying it. "Get to the back of the bus." At that, my mom stood up and said to my grandmother, "Come on, we're moving too." And so they did. I asked what the driver said, and she replied, "Nothing." And what did the other passengers say? Nothing. But each time they stopped along the way, the military personnel surrounded them to protect them from potentially angry white passengers. I marvel at this anecdote and the family in which I was raised. In early 2010, she was diagnosed with CHF, congestive heart failure. I was blessed to have traveled the hospice journey with her that commenced in May of that year, getting to be with her 7 times in the following 6 months, in the Fort Lauderdale home had shared with my father until he passed in 2008. Our conversations were about life, the universe, and everything, and I treasure each moment I had with her. At one point, she slid a ring off her pinky and handed it to me. "I want you to have this." It was my grandmother's engagement ring that she had given to my mother, and now it was mine to treasure, and it will be my bequest to my daughter-in-law when I pass. As I look at it, I feel her with me all the more powerfully. In a dream a few years ago, when I was facing challenges, I heard her proclaim, "You got what it takes, baby cakes." She was my most ardent cheerleader and always knew what to say to help me navigate sometimes fierce inner criticism. She is my stalwart, my angel, my role model for all things loving and good. When I lit the yurtzeit candle for her, I remember her doing the same for her parents on the anniversary of their passing. A multi-generational chain of love that threads its way through the fiber of my being. So this is the woman who raised me. This is the woman who instilled in me the values that I try to practice, not always perfectly, but I do consider her my cheerleader. So the cheerleaders in my life, my grandmother who died when I was 4, my parents, my friends, my family, and someone who's not here with us today, but who's going to watch this afterwards, Yvonne Kay. She's been my mentor and my dear friend for over 30 years. And since my mom died, I consider her my mama figure. So I'm going to be taking lunch to her after this. I'm picking up stuff from Pumpernicks, our favorite Jewish deli in the area. So she was my cheerleader. Another story, my 6th grade teacher, Richard Surfling, was my cheerleader. I was in a unique classroom situation. This was the 1960s, and there was a lot of experimental education going on. So the school district had what they called a non-graded class, and it consisted of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in the same classroom setting, with the idea that the older kids would mentor the younger kids, just like in my family, where the older kids in my grandmother's generation took care of the younger kids. And the reason they called it non-graded is that there were no numerical grades or letter grades. It was just commentary. And we had the freedom to express ourselves creatively. And Richard Surfling was a young teacher at the time, if memory serves, 27 years old, but was bald, even back then. And he was the teacher of all of them that I felt believed in me and encouraged me to become a writer. So fast forward more than 10 years ago, after talking about him, how people ask who your favorite teacher was and why, I realized, I should really get in touch with him and thank him for everything that he did for me, because chances are he didn't have a clue. So I looked him up, I Googled him, and it turned out that he had been the superintendent in I think it was the Runnymede School District in New Jersey. So I called the district office and they said, "You just missed him. He just retired. And I can't give you his phone number, but if you look in the Burlington County phone book," back then when we used phone books, "I bet you'll find him." So I did. I called and his wife, Marie, answered. And I explained who I was. And I said, "I'm not sure if he'll remember me." She said, "He remembers all of his students. I'm sure he'll remember you." So she yells, "Rich," and he gets on the phone and I start talking to him. He said, "Of course I remember you." And he gave some examples that told me that he did. And, I told him what a difference he made in my life. And he sounded surprised. And I said, "You have no clue? You don't know what a difference you make in your students' lives?" He says, "Well, usually my students get in touch with me after they graduate high school or maybe after college, but not 35 years later." And he said, "We should get together for a cup of coffee or tea." And then I put it aside, fully intending to do it. And then 10 years later, my friend Janet, who's on this call, was having her birthday party. And I thought, you know what? Why not do one-stop shopping? Feed 2 birds with 1 scone, because he lives in Cinnaminson. And I called and I said, "I'm going to a friend's birthday party. Can I stop by and visit you beforehand?" And this was before the pandemic. And he said, "Sure, I would love to see you." So he greeted me at the door. I broke down in tears because of what this man meant to me. And I actually, Cindy mentioned my book. He was one of the people that I thanked in my book for believing in me. And I gave him an autographed copy, and he had never seen the book before. And I spent the most glorious 2 hours with Rich and his wife, Marie. And it was like full circle. So think about the teachers that you've had, the mentors that you've had that have made a huge difference in your life, and maybe they didn't even know it. And if they're still living, reach out to them and let them know, whether it's in person or a phone call or a letter or an email, something to let them know what a difference they made in your life. And the other thing that my parents did, even though, again, they thought some of my ideas were mashugana, were crazy. When I decided to become an interfaith minister and enroll in the new seminary, my mother said, I have one question for you. Are you converting? That would have been horrible for them because I was raised Jewish, went to synagogue, went to Hebrew school till I was 16, became a bat mitzvah when I was 13. And Judaism was part of our family's at home and practice at synagogue. And I said, no. And I quoted Alan Cohen. Some of you are familiar with Alan personally or know about his work. And I said, no, I'm expanding. And I told her the story that Alan had shared when he was speaking, I think, in front of a group of Unity ministers. And they asked him, Alan, are you a Jew for Jesus? And he thought about it a minute. Now, Alan was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. And he was probably my first introduction to interfaith spirituality. And he says, well, yeah, I'm a Jew for Jesus. I'm a boy for Buddha. I'm an Alan for Allah. I'm a man for Moses. I'm a Cohen for Confucius. Wherever the light is shining or whoever's throwing the party, I want to be there. So I related that story to my mother, and she says, okay, we'll be there for your graduation. Now, they lived in Fort Lauderdale at the time. The graduation was at St. John, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. They flew up for my ordination. They were there with me during the celebration of my becoming an interfaith minister. And my mother started calling me her Reverend daughter, which I thought was very cute, kind of a takeoff on Reverend Mother. When my uncle died, Uncle Jim, Uncle Jimmy Parking Spot, my mother's older brother, I officiated at his funeral. When my parents each died, I officiated at their funerals because I didn't want a rabbi who didn't know anything about them delivering their eulogy. And it kept me sane and vertical during some of the most difficult times in my life. So they believed in me. They'd never been to a cuddle party. My mother had, she said, I would love to. I could get down on the floor, but I couldn't get back up. They said, everybody would come to you. And, don't worry, we would help haul you up. But they never made it. Neither of my parents did. So another thing that I think about, although I've never met him, I would have loved to have interviewed him, is Fred Rogers. Did anybody see the movie that Tom Hanks was in where he played Fred Rogers? Okay. Do you remember the scene in the Chinese restaurant where Lloyd, I forget the guy's last name, but the journalist who was interviewing him was talking about his relationship with his father. And it was a really difficult, painful relationship. His mother had died and his father, I think, was an alcoholic, and he was struggling. And he had thought originally that his time with Fred was going to be all about him interviewing Fred and writing an 800-word story that turned out to be a 10,000-word cover story for the publication for which he was writing. And Fred was interviewing him, trying to get him to talk about his life. And I'm going to read to you something, actually, because again, another article. I wrote an article about it called Hanging in the Hood with Fred. And I said a particularly poignant scene occurs in a Chinese restaurant as the two are sitting in a booth enjoying a vegetarian repast. Fred was a longtime vegetarian who didn't believe in anything that had a mother. Lloyd was once again tap dancing around his pain regarding his relationship with his father, who had attempted, albeit not gracefully, to heal the rift between them. Fred asked Lloyd to engage in an activity with him. For 1 minute, he was to imagine all the people who loved us into being. Even though he made that request quietly, everyone in the restaurant turned in their direction, joining them in the exercise. If you look closely, you'll see Joanne Rogers, Fred's wife, in the scene. So as part of the meditation, which we'll do later, I'm going to ask you, and you can start thinking about it now, all the people who loved you into being and who are your cheerleaders. I also differentiate between yay-sayers and naysayers. Everybody has had someone in their life that says, Nat, you can't do it. It's too hard. You'll never succeed. You're going to fall on your face. You know, what makes you think that you're capable of that? Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah. And think about what you want to say to that person. You know, you flip them the bird. I'm not going to show you my finger, but underneath the computer, you know what I'm doing here. Okay. So I also think about two famous people come to mind who were bullied as children. One of them was Lady Gaga, and the other, I believe, was Pink. And I think about famous people who made it despite the odds, despite what they were told about their talent or lack thereof. And they think about how successful they are now. And what would it be like if those people who bullied them recognized who it was they were bullying and what the impact was? And now I'd like you to think about all of your yay-sayers, all of the people who have cheered you on despite your own self-doubt, and how you can be your own cheerleader, your own naysayer. And I invite you to be the wind beneath your own wings as well. So I thank you for the opportunity to share and for you to hear my tribute to my mother, and for me to be able to share my mother with you.